Welcome to another class of Al-Bahr Al-Madid, in which we cover a thematic overview of, or a thematic study of the tafsir of Juz' Amma from the exegesis from the tafsir by Sidi ibn Ajiba radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that is titled Al-Bahr, Al-Bahr Al-Madid. So without further ado, inshallah, what we'll be covering today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we have our class divided into 3 sections. I'm sorry, something in my eyes. We have 3 sections for today's class, 2 quarters and a half, right? So the first half is divided into 2 quarters. We'll speak about Sidi ibn Ajiba radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and we'll also speak about we'll speak about the type of tafsir that we're covering, or that what is known as a tafsir al-ishari, and its relationship to the different sorts of or categories of tafsir, inshallah. And then from there, we'll speak about Al-Bahr Al-Madid itself and its author, Sayyidi ibn Ajiba. And then from there, inshallah, we'll delve into the tafsir of Juz' Amma, and specifically Surah An-Naba, the first surah in this juz, which is surah or chapter number 78 in the Quran, inshallah. طيب. So let me begin, inshallah ta'ala, with the following introduction. And this introduction will be based on actually the introduction of a work that is not related primarily to tafsir, but I like its exposition, its explanation, its illustration of the 2 layers, the 2 main layers of the Quran, which is known as al-Zahir, the external, and al-Batin, the internal. And this is done by a great scholar from the Alawi tradition, and he was also a Naqshbandi saint, Sayyidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus, who moved to Egypt and benefited many of the late Azhari scholars, like Sheikh Abdullah Sharqawi, the Sheikh Al-Azhar, and many others. And he, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's buried in Egypt, and his burial place is right next to, actually, when you go to visit Sayyidah Zainab radiallahu ta'ala anhu alayhi salam, at the entrance, you will find on your right-hand side, if you're going to the males section of the mosque, you'll find that Sayyidi, the shrine of Sayyidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus right in front of you, and then it becomes on your right-hand side as you're going to the entrance of the masjid. So he authored a book. This book is not, again, as I said, it's not on tafsir, but he provides an introduction related to this type of tafsir that we'll be reading together, inshallah. And this book is called the Fragrant Scent. I'm not sure if you heard of it before. And the Fragrant Scent is or al-arf al-atir. It is related to the distinction between the different khawatir, different thought waves. So it's as the translator mentions, on the knowledge of the motivating thoughts, meaning thought waves. So in the introduction of this text, Sayyidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus speaks about these 2 layers of the Quran. So what I will be doing, inshallah, now, I'll just be reading short excerpts from Sayyidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus, and I'll provide an explanation of them, a commentary on them, inshallah ta'ala. So he says, you should know that it has been firmly established through rigorously authenticated prophetic sayings that every single verse of the Quran has an outward meaning, which is known as dhahr or dhahir. That is, meaning of dhahir, or al-dhahr, it's well known and accepted commentary. So he's saying that it has been established through rigorously authenticated prophetic sayings that every single verse of the Quran has an outward meaning. What is the outward meaning? He said, it's well known and accepted commentary, whose remit should not go beyond what has been transmitted. And then he said, indeed, the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, referred to it in saying, whoever interprets the Quran through his personal opinion, let him take his seat in the fire. It has also been firmly established through rigorously authenticated prophetic sayings that every single verse of the Quran has an inward meaning, which is known as batn or batin, internal. He says its remit is that it does not overstep the book or the prophetic sunnah, and it should not be stated categorically that this inward meaning of the verse is the only meaning intended and nothing else. For there is a clear difference between such an interpretation and that of the batiniyah. طيب. He said this type of interpretation instead belongs to a form of supported meanings, not by recourse to reason, and without insisting categorically that it is the only intended meaning. Like, before we go on, what we learn from this is that there are two sorts. He will come now to provide the narrations, from the companions, from the pious predecessors that support this notion of the internal meanings of the Quran. The concept that he mentioned here, there are two issues. Number one, he said every single verse has an external meaning. Every single verse has an internal meaning. Then he provided a condition. He said the external meaning, we are bound in the external meaning by the boundaries of narration. We'll come to speak afterwards, and Arabic as well. So we are bound by narration, meaning by tradition. So every single verse has an external meaning. This external meaning is determined for the most part. I know you might say, he didn't say for the most part. I'll come to explain that later, inshallah. Is determined for the most part by the tradition, because some verses we don't find necessarily narrations of the Prophet ﷺ related to them, right? So in this case, we only have the narrations of the companions and the pious predecessors, and this is where the tarjih, meaning giving preference of one tafsir over the other, we can use language in this case, and so on and so forth. But what he's saying is that the external meanings of the Quran, they are bound by the narrated tafsir tradition. And one should not, when we're talking at this level, at this layer of the Quran, one should not use their own mere opinion without any grounding in the tradition, nor in the Arabic language. One should not, in an arbitrary way, say, oh, I think, I assume, my idea is that this verse is about so-and-so. He quoted the tradition, the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, forbidding this type of tafsir. So this is the external, and we'll come back to it perhaps again. And then the internal meanings of the Quran, the first condition that he mentioned, that it is impermissible. It's impermissible to claim that the internal meaning of the Quran is the only meaning of the verse. This is the first precaution of the internal meanings. because once the person does that, to claim that the internal meaning is the only meaning, that turns into the approach of the Batiniya. The approach of the Batiniya, it's a deviant sect that, again, from the name of it, Batiniya comes from batn, comes from the meaning of internal. They claim that these internal meanings are the actual and only meanings of the Quran. And that the face value, external meanings of the verses are not intended. Are not intended. This is in the view of the Batiniya. And Imam al-Ghazali refuted. I mean, he authored a book called Fada'ih al-Batiniya, and Imam al-Ghazali had part of his intellectual project, you could say, that he authored these refutations of the Batiniya. But he also, Imam al-Ghazali mentioned in Ihya Ulumuddin that the Quran, and in Jawahir al-Quran and other works of his as well, that the Quran has an external meaning and an internal meaning. And as long as we don't claim that the internal meaning is the only meaning of the verse, as long as we're not doing that, then it's fine to refer to the internal meaning and to benefit from the internal meaning, which is al-ma'na al-batin versus al-ma'na al-zahir. Okay? طيب. Let us go back to Sayyidi Aidarus. So Sayyidi Aidarus, then Sayyidi Abdul Rahman al-Aidarus gives an example. He says an example of this is the saying of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhum. Now, this is a very smart example because there are many examples that he could have referenced, but he chose specifically this example. You're going to find it relevant to what we're talking about. But also, he chose an example from Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, because Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas was the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the established authentic narration, made dua for Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. He said, Allahumma faqihhu fi ddin. Oh Allah, grant him deep understanding of meticulous matters of religion. Allahumma faqihhu fi ddin. Oh Allah, bestow upon him deep understanding of the religion. وَعَلِّمْهُ التَّأْوِيلِ, and teach him interpretation, meaning of the Quran. And of course, the dua of the Prophet ﷺ is accepted. There is no doubt about that, that the dua, that the prayers of the Prophet ﷺ are all accepted. So Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, this is a dua, but it's also the Prophet ﷺ is informing us that his cousin, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, is our resource when it comes to the tafsir of the Quran. This is why when you read Tafsir al-Tabari, for example, when you read Tafsir al-Tabari, you will find that it is full of narrations by Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And there are different chains of narration of the tafsir of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. I think there are about 5 different chains of narration in which the interpretations of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas have been systematically transmitted. Some of them are authentic, and some of them are not, and some of them are in between. And this is why when I mentioned last night at the end of the class, after Sidi Sheikh Talut, after he finished conducting the class, I mentioned that reading the traditional tafasir requires an understanding of the nuances of them. So Imam al-Tabari, when he narrates, because he provides the chain of narration to Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. Again, his tafsir is full of the opinions of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, the exegetical, the interpretations of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. Imam al-Tabari assumes that the reader is able to know the authenticity of the narration based on the chain that is provided. طيب. Having said that, coming back to Sidi al-Aidarus, so Imam al-Aidarus here is very, very, very intelligent, very, very smart. He's not giving you a random example of any companion. He chose a companion whom the Prophet ﷺ informed us that this is someone who has deep understanding of the religion, and whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon him the capacity of Quranic interpretation. And then the example that we'll read is very related to the idea, to the concept that we're talking about, which is the tafsir of the internal of the Quran. طيب. So he said an example of this is the saying of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma in the regarding the verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he sends down water of heaven, and the wadis, meaning the valleys, flow each in its measure. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends water out of heaven, meaning out of the skies, and the sky, and then the valleys flow each in its measure. So Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, what did he say? How did he interpret this verse? He said the following. He said, water in this verse means knowledge, means ilm, while valleys means the hearts. So Sidi Aidaros then explains this, and then he says, which is to say that from the heaven of the divine presence, Allah Most High manifests the water of knowledge, and each valley of those hearts, receptive to it, flows with this water into their souls to the extent of their fullness with this knowledge. Then Sidi Aidaru says, this type of interpretation is not inadmissible when there is a shift from the outward to the inward meaning, while at the same time affirming the outward meaning. What is inadmissible is the Batiniya method of interpretation that completely denies the outward meaning, which amounts to clear disbelief, wal-'iyadhu billah. So this is a clear example from one of the companions. Again, we spoke about Sayyidi Abdullah ibn Abbas, so now you know the value of his interpretation. And Sayyidi Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiallahu ta'ala, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, interprets this verse in this fashion, or this manner that we just went through together. So this is a clear example that this type of tafsir was practiced by the companions, and by this particular companion, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. Now, what is really remarkable there's a question that says, I have heard some people saying from the Sufi side that each ayah has some huge amount of meaning, such as 40,000. In effect, each ayah has 40,000 meanings, both zahir and batin. Is there any basis to these large numbers in the scholarly texts? I can't recall the 40,000 exactly, but what we'll mention actually here is that because this 40,000, it could symbolize a large amount, meaning it's not intended for it to be 40 only. Wallahu a'lam. But we will mention now, inshallah, through the words of Sayyidi Abdurrahman al-Aidaros, that there is a perpetual continuation of these interpretations. طيب. So then Sayyidi Abdurrahman al-Aidaros says, in sum, this type of interpretation, meaning which type? The internal meaning. The internal meaning. No, wait. So the Batiniya method of interpretation is not recommended to read. We don't need to read the tafsir of the Batiniya because already the scholars, the Sunni scholars, the Sufi scholars, they are Sunni. Their tafsir already provide to us a very an expanse of resources when it comes to the tafsir that cover the internal meanings, right? So these are already available. The idea is that, or the problem is that actually what you're asking about will now be answered by Sayyid Abdurrahman al-Aidarus. He says, in sum, this interpretation, this type of interpretation, varies according to the state of the interpreter, meaning the spiritual state, in terms of the clarity of his understanding, rank of gnosis, and share of closeness to Allah, proximity. It is in this context that Abu Darda radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, a man does not fully understand until he sees numerous layers of meaning in the Quran. He said, more amazing than this is the saying of Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, where he said, there's not a single verse except that it has people who will know it, meaning its interpretation. So he also mentions Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. And Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq is the son of Sayyidi Muhammad al-Baqir, who's the son of Sayyidi Ali Zayn al-Abidin, who's the son of Sayyidina al-Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. So this is the great-grandson of Sayyidina al-Husayn. This is Sayyidina Ja'far al-Sadiq, ibn Muhammad al-Baqir, ibn Ali Zayn al-Abidin, ibn al-Husayn, ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, wa Sayyida Fatima al-Zahra, bint Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So Sayyidina Ja'far al-Sadiq said, Allah has manifested himself to his servants in his speech, but people see not. And it also reported that he once fainted while performing the prayer. When he was questioned about it, he said, I kept repeating the verse until I heard it from the speaker. So Sidi Abdurrahman al-Aidarus, what he's saying here is that these internal meanings, they're actually different. So we can look at the internal of the Quran as one layer, but it has multiple layers within this internal meaning of the Quran. And these layers are peeled according to the, as he mentioned, the spiritual state, the gnosis, proximity to Allah. In other words, the rank in sainthood, and so on and so forth, right? Or the degree of piety, and so on and so forth. So, which, by the way, requires correct belief. So, as Sunnis, we are not in need of the tafsir of the Batinis. We have the exegesis of the Quran that serve al-Zahir, and this is the meaning of external. And we have exegesis by the Sunni saints that cover the internal meanings. One of them is Al-Bahr al-Madid, which actually provides the two layers. It provides the two layers. Sayyidi Ibn Ajiba radiallahu ta'ala anhu begins with Sayyidi Ibn Ajiba radiallahu ta'ala anhu, what he does is that he applies in a practical way what Sayyidi Abdurrahman al-Aidarus mentions here. I'm not saying that he's influenced because there's a time gap, but Sayyidi Ibn Ajiba is prior Sayyidi Abdurrahman. What I'm saying is that what we just covered now, you will find it practiced, implemented by Sayyidi Ibn Ajiba. Why? Because he begins by the external and then he goes to the internal. طيب. ظاهر external and batin is internal. Correct. Correct. Despite Abdullah ibn Abbas being granted the title Tarjuman al-Quran, many mufassirun do not always refer to his interpretation. Why is this? Many mufassirun like whom? Let us conclude this part before moving on to speak about different sorts of tafsir and so on and so forth. I don't think so. It's not published by IGP. All right. Lastly, he said, let us go back and finish what we started. We say that every single verse of the Quran also has a limit, has a boundary. This is what he means by limit, such that textual-based evidence should not be omitted in favor of reason in its outward meaning and in its inward meaning. It should not overstep the grammatical rules of Arabic language or that which is intelligible. What he means by that, it should not contradict rationality. It should not contradict the principles of logic. It should not affirm a logical contradiction. It should not affirm a logical contradiction. So there are three conditions that we learn from Sidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus regarding, actually four conditions regarding the internal meanings. Number one, the internal meaning is a meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first condition is that the purity of the heart. The purity of the heart. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows the knowledge of the internal meanings upon pure hearts. So this is the first condition. Second condition, that we should never claim that the internal meaning is the only meaning, is the actual and only meaning of the verse. Third condition, it should not go against the Arabic grammatical rules. What if the verse has more than one grammatical interpretation? Then it should at least meet one of them. Fourth, it should not affirm a logical contradiction. These are the four conditions as stated by Sayyidi Abdul Rahman Al-Aidarus in the Fragrant Scent. The remaining of the book is on a different topic, but he mentioned that in the beginning. Okay, sure. For a reason, by the way, but it's beyond the scope of our class. Okay, so the four conditions of the internal meanings of the internal tafsir or tafsir al-ma'na al-batin of the verses of the ayat of the Quran. Number one, I summarize. I mean, we can actually dissect number one into 1A, 1B, 1C. The one is about the purity of the heart. He mentioned the spiritual, what we mean by the purity of the heart, the spiritual state the gnosis, the degree of gnosis, the degree of knowledge, and proximity, degree of proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I combine these three into one condition. I call it the purity of the heart. And then the second condition. So the first condition for that internal meaning to actually manifest within one's heart, it requires purity. And based on this, on the degree of the purity, that the meaning is bestowed. So this first condition. Second condition, one should never claim that the internal meaning is the actual and only meaning of the verse. It is one of the meanings. Actually, one of the internal meanings only. That's the only claim we can make. One of the internal meanings. So this is the second condition. Third condition, it should not contradict the Arabic grammatical rules. If there is a grammatical variety in a particular verse, then it should at least match one of them. The fourth condition, it should not it should not establish a logical, something that is of a logical contradiction. It should not affirm a logical contradiction. These are the four conditions. Perhaps you might find other scholars detail more conditions for this, but these four conditions are key. طيب. Yes, I mean the work by Sayyidi Abdul Rahman al-Aidarus, it's one of its kind, it's on this subject matter, the classification of thought waves. It is maybe one of two or three, but I would say it's in my opinion the primary resource when it comes to this subject matter, because the Sufi scholars who address these issues, they address them in a sporadic way. So this is the only consolidated work addressing this subject. Otherwise, you may find scattered here and there. You might find some of the early treatises, some of the treatises by the early Sufis, early Hakim al-Tirmidhi, maybe even prior to Hakim al-Tirmidhi, and so on and so forth. You definitely find that in Ihya al-Din. But as a stand-alone consolidated work on thought waves, I don't know of any other work besides. I'm sure that there is, by the way, but I don't know of any other that at least has been published and also been translated. Wallah. Ustad, are you saying that the Quranic interpretation is a living, ongoing activity, and this adds to the layers of the meaning? Oh, absolutely. This is exactly what I want to say, and mashallah, you have worded the meaning that I wanted to say in a very eloquent way. Jazakumullah ta'ala khair. This is exactly what I wanted to say. Not all Mufassirun take the hadith and narration approach. Example, Ibn Ashur, Alusi. طيب. Okay, let us move to this subject then. And I see that time is running by, but in case we don't get to go through the tafsir today, I hope that is okay for you guys, but at least because once we have this done, we will not. It's basically the basis for everything else that we're doing later on. So I apologize if we didn't get to the second part where we actually read parts from Surah An-Naba today, but at least we can get this done, because this will benefit you throughout, not just Al-Wahl al-Madid. It will benefit you throughout your you could say your reading experience with tafasir and so on and so forth. So I hope that is fine, inshallah, with you guys, bi'idhnillah. I'm here, inshallah, with you until all your questions related to the different types of tafsir and interpretations are covered, inshallah. Okay, I was answering a question. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Not all mufassirun, meaning not all the mufassir, meaning not all the scholars of tafsir. Mufassirun, this is the Arabic plural of mufassir, meaning a scholar of tafsir, of interpretation. Take the hadith and narration approach. Example, Ibn Ashur and Alusi. طيب. To talk about Imam Ibn Ashur in At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, or the tafsir of Imam Al-Alusi and so on and so forth, these are very late scholars. Imam Ibn Ashur in the previous century, Imam Al-Alusi right before him. So in order to speak about this category of tafsir, we have to go way back. Why? Because the likes of Ibn Ashur and Al-Alusi is more of a school that sort of combined more than one approach together. So we need to understand where they take from before coming to these approaches. طيب. Traditionally, we have two sorts of tafsir. Two sorts of tafsir. There is a tafsir through narration. And the examples of the tafsir through narration, obvious example is tafsir al-Imam al-Tabari. You know, Imam al-Tabari, his tafsir is published in Arabic in about 30 volumes, 30 thick volumes. When he wanted to author his tafsir, and he also authored an encyclopedia of history. When he wanted to author his tarikh, his history encyclopedia, and also his tafsir, he said to his students, because he dictated these works, by the way. These works were dictated by Imam al-Tabari. He said, he told his students, I want to dictate a tafsir. So they told him, in how many volumes, so that we can prepare the papers, right? Because they have to, get the ink and the feathers that they use, or the pens that they use, and the papers, and so on and so forth. So they need to prepare for the project. So Imam al-Tabari said, said something along the lines of 30,000. I can't remember 30,000. What is the actual unit? That they like a 30,000 booklet, something of that sort. So they told him, we cannot. This is too much. So he brought the 30,000 to 3,000, and when it's published now in modern day printing, it's 30 volumes. So the 30 volumes that are printed of the tafsir Imam al-Tabari, this is 1/10, 10% of what Imam al-Tabari originally wanted to write. Same thing applies for his tarikh. And when that happened, he was saddened and disappointed that his students are not as enthusiastic as him. He said, ضاعت الهمم. He says, motivation is no longer present. He said, where is the enthusiasm? طيب. So Imam al-Tabari, this is the famous example of a Quranic interpretation that is based on narration. Based on narration. And I will come back to Imam al-Tabari when we speak about the different category. There are other tafasir that also address the interpretation of the Quran from a narration point of view, meaning they mention the verse and then they list the different narrations, whether prophetic narrations, narrations of the companions, of the tabi'een, and so on and so forth. Another example a tafsir that is based on narration is the tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim. Is a great scholar, a great hadith scholar. It's another example. And another example of a tafsir by narration is the tafsir of Imam al-Baghawi. But Imam al-Baghawi shortens the chains of narration. He sort of summarized the chains of narration, but it's a tafsir based on narration. The tafsir of Imam al-Baghawi. Imam Baghawi was a great Shafi'i jurist, a great Shafi'i muhaddith and jurist and scholar of tafsir, Imam al-Baghawi. And his tafsir is much shorter than Imam al-Tabari's. Another example, but rather a late tafsir, is the tafsir, I believe Imam al-Suyuti has one similar to the work by Imam Ibn Abi Hatim in some respects. So these are examples of tafsir that are based on interpretation. Now, there are other tafsir. These are tafsir that are based on narration, rather, based on narration. Tafsir Ibn Kathir can be also categorized as such. Tafsir Ibn Kathir, because it's also, we mentioned yesterday that Imam Ibn Kathir, when he was writing the tafsir, one could imagine that he had the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, again, printed in about over 30 volumes. It includes over about 33,000 ahadith. Scholars claim that Imam Ibn Kathir wrote a Quranic interpretation using the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. He utilized the Musnad, included the Musnad within the tafsir of the Quran. So for the most part, it is a tafsir that is based on narration. When we come to the other types of tafsir, which is technically known as at-tafsir bil-ra'i. Al-ra'i linguistically means opinion. Yes, ad-durr al-manthur, correct. Linguistically, al-ra'i means opinion. But scholars classify at-tafsir bil-ra'i to tafsir that is accepted and tafsir that is not accepted. Maqbool or mamduh versus one that is madhmoom, condemned. The tafsir bil-ra'i that is condemned is the tafsir that is done in an arbitrary way. Done in an arbitrary way. It's based on assumption, not based on knowledge. You could say in some cases can be based on illusion. The person is not actually interpreting the Quran based on actual gnosis or knowledge. Now, the tafsir bil-ra'i that came to be accepted is the tafsir bil-ra'i that is done through a linguistic approach to the Quran. Now, I want you to realize something. Imam al-Tabari used language in giving preference to the opposing or to the different narrations of interpretation. So sometimes you have different narrations. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas is narrating something. Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib is narrating something. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is narrating something. And then the Tabi'een, Al-Dhahhak, Muqatil, Ata, different Masruq, different Tabi'een and Tabi'een have different interpretations. And Imam al-Tabari would find that he would categorize. He says, this verse, there's more than one interpretation. The first one. And then he says, the first one is narrated or is the opinion of so and so and so. And then he mentions the narrations. And then he says, al-qawl al-thani, the second opinion. is the opinion of so and so and so. And then he mentions the chains of narrations. And then قول الثالث. And sometimes there are 4 or 5. And then what Imam al-Tabari does, in some cases he reconciles. In other cases, he gives preference to one narration over the other. How does he do that? He does that by Arabic. He does that by using Arabic in some cases. So he uses Arabic as a way to give preference of some opinions over the others. طيب. What about the tafsirs that uses Arabic, where they begin by the linguistic interpretation? They begin by the linguistic interpretation, but in sometimes, actually many times, many cases, or you could actually say all cases, that the tafsir has more than one linguistic way to interpret the meaning of the verse. Now, scholars give preferences to the linguistic interpretation based on a number of issues. One of them is narration. One of them is their theological school. So to them, yes, I am using language, but I am giving preference of the opinion based on theology. And to them, theology is affirmed by rational arguments and by textual evidence as well. So there is an implicit component of tradition that is used to give one linguistic interpretation, to give it preference over the other. So there is always this tradition component. If it's an issue related to fiqh, even if they begin with language, it goes within the lines of what has been established in their fiqh school. So sometimes they begin with narration, and then they use language as a preference, as a way of giving preference. Sometimes they begin with language and narration or tradition, so narration in the general sense of the term, is used in giving preference. Right? And all in all, you could say that the linguistic interpretations, they emerged later than the tafsirs by narration. Who are the ones who used language in their tafsir before anyone else? The scholars of tafsir who are known for using narration, like Imam al-Tabari, because he used language to give preference for some narrations over the others. So you could say that the boundaries of the external meaning or the external meanings were already set and established by these early tafsir. So the tafsir through language that came later on, they all revolve within the boundaries that were already set by those earlier mufassirin. And the legitimacy of using language in interpretation has already been given by the scholars of narration, like Imam al-Tabari, because they use language to give preference for some narrations over the others when they contradict or when they oppose each other. Now, when it comes to the tafsir by language, you have different styles of them. So you have not different styles, but different schools. The most notable one is the tafsir by Imam al-Zamakhshari. But Imam al-Zamakhshari was a Mu'tazili. But he was a great linguist as well. So this is why the Sunnis, they tried, Sunnis here in the specific sense, because Imam Zamakhshari was a Sunni in the general sense of the word Sunni, because he's not Shi'i. But the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they benefited from Imam al-Zamakhshari. And there are scholars who wrote super commentaries pinpointing the Mu'tazili aspects, like Ibn al-Munayr, and the super commentaries that were written on the tafsir of Al-Kashaf by Zamakhshari, by Sayyid Sharif Jurjani, by Al-Taftazani, by Al-Tibi, by Qutb al-Din al-Razi, a number of interpretations, a number of super commentaries that were written on Al-Kashaf by Zamakhshari. Later on, within the Ash'ari school and the Maturidi school, there came to be tafasir that provided the same service as the Zamakhshari, but within the theological boundaries of the Ash'ari or the Maturidi. So Imam al-Baydawi wrote a tafsir that was supposed to substitute for the Ash'aris the tafsir of Al-Kashaf. There is tafsir by Imam al-Nasafi, a Maturidi scholar, that benefited from al-Baydawi and benefited from Al-Kashaf. Right? And then the different linguistic tafasir later on emerged as Tafsir al-Jalalain by Imam Jalaluddin al-Mahalli and Jalaluddin al-Suyuti. It's a combined project, and so on and so forth. The tafsir of Imam al-Razi, because I saw that some of you asked about this, the tafsir of Imam al-Razi is encyclopedic. You cannot categorize it under tafsir by narration or tafsir by language, because it utilizes all the different sciences. It includes narration, and it includes language, and it includes theology, and it includes fiqh, and it includes all different sorts. And this approach of Imam al-Razi, you could say, was employed by a number of late scholars. One of them is Imam al-Alusi. I would say Imam al-Alusi was on the footsteps of Imam al-Razi. Imam Ibn Ashur, similarly, but Imam Ibn Ashur had a more linguistic approach. Rather than anything else. So he's more on the language. And then there are, and I apologize, I mean, I cannot encompass all the different sort of classifications and all the different sort of nuances. I'm speaking in a very, very general way. I'm assuming that most of you here are hearing this for the first time. So for those who are more advanced, please forgive me if I'm not going into some of the details deeper, because I want to have I want to have the class suitable for the different levels of students. There are certain tafasir that gave specific attention. So, for example, Tafsir Imam al-Qurtubi. Tafsir Imam al-Qurtubi includes narration, includes language, but its primary focus is on fiqh. But it's a tafsir of the whole Quran. But his primary focus, fiqh. Does it include narration? Of course. Does it include language? Definitely. Does it include theology? Yes. Does it include spirituality? Yes. But its primary focus, fiqh. And then there are tafasir, there are partial tafasir, like tafsir ayat al-ahkam. It's not a tafsir of the whole Quran. It's a tafsir only of the verses related to jurisprudence. Like Tafsir Ayat al-Ahkam by Imam Jassas al-Hanafi. There is a tafsir of Ayat al-Ahkam by Imam Shafi'i himself. A tafsir of Ayat al-Ahkam by Ilki al-Harrasi, the Shafi'i. Tafsir Ayat al-Ahkam by Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, the Maliki jurist, the student of Imam al-Ghazali. There is also a tafsir of the verses related to theology and related to the principles of jurisprudence, of Usul al-Fiqh, which is by Imam Najm al-Din al-Tufi al-Hanbali in 3 volumes. It has been published in Arabic. Meaning I don't think it has been translated yet. So these are, I mean, alhamdulillah, our ummah has been, I mean, there's a very rich tradition of tafsir. Now, the tafsir that we're reading by Imam Ibn Ajiba is, let me give you an example, and we use this to illustrate. Where can we purchase a hard copy of this book, of this course? I would assume that it will be available by Imam Ghazali Publishing at some point, inshallah. but this is my own assumption. I didn't ask them about this, but I can ask the team and they can come back to you on this, inshallah. Let me show you an example um, of what Imam Ibn Ajiba does. Let me share with you 1 second. So what I will do is that I will share with you the Arabic first, and it's available online. And the reason I'm doing so is because the tafsir that we have by Sheikh Talut, the translation is a, you could say, is a distilled version of Al-Bahr al-Madid. So when you read here, he goes through عَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. عَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. What he begins by a linguistic treatment. He says عَمَّ أصله عَمَّ with an alif. And then he says حُذِفَت الألف, meaning the alif has been ruled out. And then he uses a verse in the Alfiyya by Imam Ibn Malik, which is a grammar text, explaining that the alif of al-istifham, how it is ruled out in writing, that it's not written. And then he explains why this alif has been cancelled. He says وحذفها إما للفرق بين الاستفهامية والموصولة أو للتخفيف لكثرة الاستعمال. He says the reason, he's explaining the reason why it's cancelled, because there is the grammatical letter ma, mim alif in Arabic can be a way of asking what is, but it can also can refer to the meaning of the term alladhi, which is al-mawsula. So it's a very nuanced grammatical issue. Very nuanced grammatical issue. So he goes through the grammar of the beginning of the verse. It goes through this, and then quotes some of the tafasir that deal with the external meaning. What did they say about an-naba al-azim, the great news? What is it? And then he would quote. He said, قال الورتجبي, and then apologize. And then he quotes Abu Saud, a very notable Ottoman scholar who authored a tafsir, very important tafsir during his time. Right? So what he does, he doesn't go into detailed narration, but rather what Imam Ibn Ajiba did is that he distilled a number of tafasir that were used, or a number of tafasir that dealt with the external meanings of the Quran. In some cases, you may find narrations, but he uses these different sources to provide almost like a summary of what has been mentioned in terms of the external meanings, almost like his preferences, his own scholarly choices when it comes to the external meanings of the Quran. And then after he does that, he goes on to the internal meaning. He goes to the internal meaning. Let me move from the Arabic to the English. 1 second. So we'll share the file with you. So you see him here. This is عَمَّا يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. What are they asking one another about? Sidi Sheikh Talut, Jazallah Ta'ala Khair, he distilled. I mean, he did not translate all the grammatical nuances. But rather, he mentioned that the format of a question serves to magnify and express alarm and surprise at their disputing therein, despite its evident truthfulness and its inimitability, i'jaz, that proves the veracity of its contents, right? Now, this level is still the surface level of the verse. This is still the surface level of the verse. But this is a surface level of the verse that allows for the internal level. The internal level of this, as Sidi ibn Ajiba says here, one second. As Sidi ibn Ajiba says here, he says al-ishara. So what he does in each verse, after covering the external meaning, he provides what he calls ishara. Ishara means a remark. Remark. And this has been, it's like a subtle remark. Al-ishara, a subtle remark. A subtle implication. And scholars in the tradition is that they call these interpretations of the internal meanings, they call these sort of tafsir as at-tafsir al-ishari. Ishari comes from the word ishara, which means the subtle implication, subtle remark. Subtle and implicit. So after he goes through the explicit, he goes to the implicit. Now, what does he mention in the implicit? He says, إن ظهرت أنوار الطريق ولاحت أسرار أهل التحقيق كثر الكلام بين الناس فيها والتساؤل عنها. كثر الكلام بين الناس فيها والتساؤل عنها. فيقال في شأنهم عما يتساءلون عن النبأ العظيم الذي هو ظهور الحق وشهوده الذي هم فيه مختلفون فمنهم من ينكره رأسا ومنهم من يقره في الجملة. So Sidi ibn Ajiba is saying that just like the Quran, when the Quran has been revealed, people became in disputation about it. They were asking one another, what is it all about? They became to talk and discuss and deliberate about the Quran, what it is, what does it say, what does it entail. And after this deliberation, after this discussion, after this talk, some of them accepted, rather he begins, he says, some of them rejected, and some of them accepted in general, holistically, fil jumla, meaning without necessarily, because they were so astonished by the great meanings, by the i'jaz of the Quran, by the eloquence of the Quran. So even if some of the subtleties, they still don't know what it means. Some of the nuances, they don't know it, but they already, in general, have been greatly astonished and greatly touched. So Sidi ibn Ajiba uses this to say that the Quran is also teaching us that similarly, like what happened with the Quran, a similar issue happened with the Sufi tradition, with the spiritual tradition in Islam. When scholars came to expose the deep spiritual meanings of our religion, believers from within, Muslims, disputed, started to have discussions and deliberation. Some rejected altogether. Some rejected, said, no, we're not going to accept what the Sufis are saying. He said, but others accepted holistically in general, even if they don't know all the nuances, even if they don't know all the subtleties. But they were astonished by what was brought, by what was introduced, by what was revealed by the saints, the heirs of the Prophet ﷺ. So they believed fil jumla, generally, even if they don't know all the deep meanings, even if they don't know the actualization of these meanings, but they believed in them. So Sayyid ibn Ajiba uses the external meaning to refer to the internal meaning. Now, the internal meaning, and I'll conclude by this, inshallah, the internal meaning for the saints is often what comes to their heart when they're reciting the Quran, as they feel that Allah is speaking to them personally. So Sayyid ibn Ajiba, as we know, was one of the great saints of his time and one of the great saints of all time. And in his works of the spiritual tradition, he revealed a number of, you could say, spiritual gems brought out from the treasures of Islamic spirituality and provide an exposition, an illustration, detailed some of what was not, as each one of them details some of the matters that were not revealed by those before him. And that caused and still causes some disputation, some argument, some back and forth, some deliberation. So I want you to imagine this. Sayyid ibn Ajiba, as he is reciting the Quran, عَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ, comes to his mind not the disbelievers, not necessarily the disbelievers with the Prophet ﷺ, but those who reject the spiritual tradition in Islam, who have been arguing back and forth. عَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ, what are they asking about? عَنِ النَّبَإِ الْعَظِيمِ, that the spiritual gems, the deep meanings, the exposition of the spiritual realities that were illustrated and detailed by the heirs of the Prophet ﷺ, this became for them النبأ العظيم. So النبأ العظيم externally is the Quran. النبأ العظيم internally are the internal meanings of the Quran. And these internal meanings were exposed, were revealed, were brought out to the surface by the saints of the Ummah. The Prophet ﷺ said, العلماء ورثة الأنبياء. The scholars are the heirs of prophets. وإن الأنبياء لم يورثوا دينارا ولا درهما. Prophets did not leave behind wealth to be distributed as inheritance. وإنما ورثوا العلم. They left behind knowledge. They passed on knowledge. فمن أخذ به أخذ بحظ وافر. Whoever acquires this has acquired a great bounty. This hadith doesn't just tell us that people think that this hadith is only about the virtue of scholarship and so on. This hadith also tells us something, that there is a continuation of a flow of knowledge that will continue to be revealed, and will continue to be exposed, and will continue to be illustrated, and so on and so forth. Right? So an-naba' al-azim is not was not a one event that began and ended. An-Naba al-Azim is still present. An-Naba al-Azim is still present. What are they asking about? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, amma yatasa'alun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the momentous news. So the momentous news is still ongoing. It is not an event that ended. The Quran has been revealed. Salamu alaykum, alaykum salam. No. The internal meanings of the Quran still remain to be, in a sense, revealed. How are they revealed? Through the saints. Through the saints. And because of this, there is a continuous flow of momentous news of Naba al-Azim. And because there is a continuous flow of the momentous event, there is still an ongoing disputation. There is still an ongoing disagreement. عن النبأ العظيم الذي هم فيه مختلفون, over which they disagree. And then he said subhanahu wa ta'ala, كلا سيعلمون ثم كلا سيعلمون. So this is how Sayyid ibn Ajiba uses the external as a springboard for the internal. And as you could see, the internal is based on the external. So if we ever cancel the external, that actually results in the cancellation of the internal for the Sunnis. The Sunnis, they say that the foundation is the external meaning. If we ever cancel it, then we're canceling the internal one. So without an external meaning, there isn't an internal one. See? And this is why Sunnis are not Batinis. The Batinis, they use the internal to cancel the external. Very well, inshallah. I apologize, we went a little bit over time. But I know we started about 11:05. But khair, inshallah, as we were waiting for the brothers and sisters to come in class and so on and so forth. Inshallah, we'll pick up from where we left off tomorrow, bi'idhnillah. I know we were supposed to begin in Juz' Am and also to talk about Sayyid ibn Ajib a little bit, but I hope, inshallah, that the way the class rounded up to be executed, I pray, inshallah, that was beneficial and useful for everyone, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Jazakumullah ta'ala khairan wa barakallah ta'ala fikum. Tomorrow, inshallah, we'll meet bi'idhnillah ta'ala at the same time.